Thank you. Question number 2, Tess White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on its role in ensuring that public bodies are meeting their legal obligations under the Equality Act 2010, following recent correspondence from the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville.
The Scottish Government is considering the letter from the Equality and Human Rights Commission and will of course engage with the Commission. Under the Equality Act 2010 Specific Duties Scotland Regulations 2012, public authorities are under a duty to assess and review proposed new or revised policies and practices. This Government stands firmly behind the separate and single-sex exemptions provided in the 2010 Act. Members will be aware this allows for trans people to be excluded when this is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Public bodies are responsible for complying with the 2010 Act and its regulations.
Tess White.
Cabinet Secretary, the Equalities Regulator wrote to NHS 5 last week, pointing out that under statutory public sector equality duties, the Health Board must, and I quote, assess and review proposed new or revised policies or practices. The Herald reports today that NHS 5 skipped this vital step when it allows a trans-identified male doctor to use a female changing room. This is serious. It means that it may have failed to comply with its legal obligations to assess the impact of its policies on women. So let me ask the Cabinet Secretary a very simple question. Does she know how many other NHS institutions are operating this potentially unlawful policy?
Cabinet Secretary.
As ministers have made clear on a number of occasions, we cannot comment on ongoing cases such as the one in NHS 5. In general, Presiding Officer, I have also made clear in my original answer that ministers are very clear that they stand firmly behind the provisions in the Equality Act and the exemptions contained within it. We absolutely expect public bodies to conduct their policies and their procedures in line with the legislation in place. As the EHRC said in their letter, they are the statutory regulator for equality in Scotland and they promote and enforce compliance with the Equality Act 2010. Ministers are, as we always have been, happy to discuss with the Commission how the Scottish Government and the Commission can help public bodies comply with their obligations under the Equality Act.
Tess White.
Cabinet Secretary, the EHRC was clear in its correspondence that the Scottish Government, and we're here now talking about the Scottish Government, has a role, it does have a role, in ensuring that NHS Scotland and other public bodies are meeting their legal obligations under the Equality Act 2010. And I'm glad that the Cabinet Secretary does today say that it will fulfil its duties. Caroline Lamb is the Chief Executive of NHS Scotland and sits at the Scottish Government's top table as Director General for Health and Social Care. Failings like these lead straight to the heart of the Scottish Government. SNP ministers keep trying to ride two horses on single-sex spaces, but they can't keep reading out the same script that sex is protected under the Equality Act 2010 while arguing in the UK's highest court that sex does not mean biological sex. And my question, Presiding Officer, is will this SNP government protect single-sex spaces for biological women in Scotland's public services, yes or no?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member refers to another live court case and therefore I, of course, will not comment on that. And with the greatest respect to Tess White, the reason why the answers from Scottish ministers are the same is because they are based on the legislation that is in place, that is the Equality Act and the regulations I mentioned in my previous answer. The Government absolutely expects all public bodies to fulfil their obligations under the regulations that are based under the Equalities Act. And the reasons the answers are similar, for the benefit of the member once again, is because that is our clear expectation. There has been no change in the Government's policy. As I said in my original answer, we stand firmly behind the 2010 Act and the exemptions that are within that. That has been the policy of this Government all along.
Thank you. We are now past the scheduled time for this item of business. I'm going to allow it to continue for a few minutes, but I absolutely must insist on concise questions and responses, and I call Carol Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if she is confident that all health and safety workplace regulations are being complied with and that all public bodies have single-sex toilets clearly marked male and female? Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary that in her answer she gives us evidence on how she has collected this data, and if it is not available, commit to obtaining such information?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member quite rightly points to the fact that there are other regulations on top of the ones I've mentioned in my original answer, for example, those that specifically refer to the workplace. But I would once again say that they are also contained within the belief that the government has that all public bodies should fulfil their obligations under all pieces of legislation with reference to this, and those include those that are specifically in relation to the workplace.
Rachel Hamilton.
Presiding Officer, does the Cabinet Secretary have full confidence that all public sector bodies in Scotland, including NHS Scotland, are complying with the requirements set out in the Equality Act 2010 to produce an impact equality assessment in relation to the provision of single-sex spaces? Yes or no?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, once again, for the benefit of the member, we are very, very committed to working with the EHRC. There's a role for government and there is a role for the Commission in this. As I said in an earlier answer, they are the statutory regulator for equality in Scotland, and they promote and enforce compliance with the Equality Act and indeed have guidance on these very matters. And we look forward to working with the Commission and indeed meeting with the Commission in due course to discuss these matters in detail.
Bill Fitzpatrick.
Given the tenor and tone of questioning in this area, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how we can make sure that trans people across Scotland feel included and protected in their workplace?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it's very important, Presiding Officer, that all of us in this chamber ensure that we conduct ourselves in a manner where we respect everyone's rights. And we are quite rightly questioned on the promotion and the protection of women's rights, and that is absolutely integral to the work that the Scottish Government does. We will continue to support the trans community. They are one of the most marginalised in Scotland, and it is important that we do so, but we will not do that in a way that provides any doubt on our commitment to the Equality Act and ensuring that single-sex space exemptions exist and should have practical effect.
Thank you. Ash Regan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Lack of clarity, and I have to say lack of understanding of the law from the government, has left working women in Scotland in the absolutely ridiculous position of having legally provided single-sex spaces open to anyone who identifies into them. The Minister has repeatedly said that she expects public bodies to uphold the law, but I'm not hearing what the government is doing about it. So perhaps I can make a suggestion. Perhaps this might be able to be got under control by the government by making the upholding of public sector duties a condition of their funding. Will the government commit to that?
Cabinet Secretary.
I go back to the point, Presiding Officer, that the Government expects all public bodies to actually respect and obey and comply with the law and have that in procedures, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Members, do let's ensure that we are not shouting over one another. And I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have to say to the Cabinet Secretary, all we are getting is the same answer every time, and it's not good enough. I know it's uncomfortable for the Government, but they must respond to the questions that members have. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, she said in her statement that she and the Government are considering the letter from the EHRC. It was sent last week. It's 1 page long and only contains 6 paragraphs. So how much longer do they need to consider the letter? Will they publish their response to the EHRC? And when they have done so, will they bring forward a statement in this chamber to finally answer questions about this issue?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, for the avoidance again of any doubt, Presiding Officer, the answers are similar because they're based on the law of the land and the Equality Act, and that's exactly what this government will continue to refer back to. The member raises the point about the letter. Yes, it's a reasonably short letter, but it does contain important challenges and questions of the government, and I think it is important that we do take time to reflect on that. And indeed, if we didn't, Presiding Officer, I think members would be here criticising us for that. We will, of course, move forward with meeting with the Commission. We do look forward to working with them. There is an important role for the Government and an important role for the Commission in this, and I'm sure members will have ample opportunity to continue to question Government on this over the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you. That concludes topical questions.